Hello and welcome to Insight. Today we have with us a very special guest, Ms Devika Malik. Devika is a para athlete and has won 8 national medals and 3 international medals in the World Athletics Grand Prix competitions. She is a disability inclusion activist and the co-founder for Wheeling Happiness Foundation. She also has the distinction of being on the Forbes 30 Under 30 list. She has also in 2021 won the National Youth Award. Join us today as we discuss the challenges that Devika has faced since birth and what we can learn from her journey. Devika, it is such a privilege for me to have you on our show today. I really want to begin by asking you that, you look wonderful, you look so smart, you're so independent, you've been such a high achiever, but nobody would believe if I said that you were born with a disability. Could you explain to us what this disability was?
First of all, thank you so much for having me on the show. Specific to my disability, it's something called hemiplegia, and it falls under the larger umbrella of cerebral palsy. So what that means is that one side of my body is about 50% the strength of the other side of my body. In my case, it's the left side. So due to a traumatic injury on the right side of the brain, the left side of my body was completely paralyzed when I was an infant. And then years of occupational therapy and hard work, I would say mostly on my mother's part, because as a toddler, I didn't know what I was going through, but she kept at it. She ensured even the finest finger movements, which were done by emptying a box of pulses and then picking up one piece of dal at a time with each finger. That's the kind of extensive occupational therapy I have gone through as a child and continue to go through, because this is a lifelong disability. So it's only with intense occupational therapy and physiotherapy that my mother was able to get me to walk again. Of course, it has left its lifelong traces where I still have struggled with issues of balance and other neuromuscular things, which are not very apparent. Like you said, if you look at me, you won't be able to tell. And that is one of the fascinating things about disability as well in general, that not all disabilities are apparent or visible at the first go. So that is why we have to be very, very sensitive, very, very inclusive in our approach, because you can't always look at a person and tell what kind of disability they are living with.
Absolutely, but tell me, when you were younger, were you aware of your disability, and did society make you aware of it? Let's say when you were in school, or when you started interacting with the outside world.
Absolutely, there were instances. I would personally say that in the larger scheme of things, I have been luckier to find environments that were very accepting. But especially when you're a young child with disability, you're a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old, and your peers in a regular able-bodied school, you've not seen somebody who has a severe limp. So my classmates obviously found me the odd one out. They didn't know what they were looking at. So as a 6-year-old child, I can't even blame them, but I think that is where the role of parents comes in, to expose your children to as many different types of people as possible, because there were instances when I was really young where I would get laughed at by my classmates, or even teachers for that matter, every time, because my dad was serving in the army, so every 2 years we were changing stations. So it would take a while for teachers to catch on, because my writing speed was really slow. So they would erase the board by the time I would be writing the first line. They would get on the 10th line and just erase the text off. And then it would take a few weeks for them to understand what my accommodation needs were, and then finally figured out that I am not mentally challenged or I am not a slow child. It's just that I have certain physical accommodations that are required. And initially it used to bother me. Like I remember very vividly 1 or 2 times that I have gone home crying to my parents. But my mother told me early on that, if you want me to come to school and like fight your battles on your behalf, I can do that, but that's not going to work in the long run. So as a very young child, I learned this lesson that it's better to laugh with people than to be laughed at. And even as a 6-year-old, whatever I could comprehend about my disability, I would, explain to children that this is not my fault. This is a disability that I have, and there are other things that I can do. So I wasn't very comfortable doing team sports because I had this inhibition that, if I play football, I have coordination issues, I have hand-eye coordination issues, so I won't ever be able to really hit the ball, or any other sport for that matter. I had this inhibition that I'll, hold back the team. So instead of that, I explored other things which my mother encouraged me to do, like public speaking. So from a very young age, I was doing debates, I was taking part in dramas, because again, their focus was to ensure that I was a public facing person and I did not become an introvert because of the concerns around my disability. So kind of having these coping mechanisms from a young age, and taking people with you on that journey, rather than feeling sorry for yourself, that has really helped me.
That's amazing. But your mother's been a national icon as well, and she has also been also has been disabled to a certain extent. Do you think you derived a lot of your strength from her and what she had experienced?
Absolutely. In fact, I would say that for whatever reason you call it destiny or whatever you call it, we have been in this boat together. I was around 8 years old, still going through all my intensive treatments and occupational therapy, and still kind of learning to walk properly again. When my mother was diagnosed with spinal tumors, and now it's been almost 24 years that she has been a wheelchair user because of those spinal tumors had to be removed, and then eventually she couldn't control the movement in her legs anymore. And there are other complications that come with that. She doesn't have any bladder or bowel control. But if you look at the amount of countries that she has traveled, the amount of medals that she has won for the country, and the firsts that she has established, being a woman with a disability and kind of traversing all of those boundaries and breaking all the ceilings to allow more women like herself to follow behind her. She became the first woman in the country to win a medal at the Paralympics. And up until that point, every time an international team used to go somewhere in disability sport, you would barely see any women in the team. And just in the last 4-5 years after she won that medal, those numbers have changed drastically. Now we have at least 30-40% women in the team wherever it's going for any international tournaments. So she's always not just done things, but by doing those things, she has always opened doors for others like her. And living that experience along with her, experiencing my own disability, experiencing the challenges and the taboos that came with her disability as well, and fighting against that as an upper middle class household, and still experiencing those taboos and those comments from the society. I think collectively our first thought was that if in an educated society, in an upper middle class society, we can go through this, then imagine others like us who do not have that backing of education or financial security, what must they go through? And that is where our journey of kind of giving back to people like ourselves started.
So, you mentioned earlier on that, when you were in school, and that also must have been, good upper class schools, there was a lack of exposure, and that was challenging. What other major challenges do you think are faced even today by people with disabilities?
Even today, I would say that lack of exposure does remain a concern. But what has changed is that inclusion has become a part of the national conversation. We have a whole agenda that runs around accessible India. We talk about inclusive India whenever we talk about new India or India at 75. All of these kind of campaigns that are launched in the recent years always target being inclusive. And what that does is, over and above the government schemes, for example, now 3 times more disabilities are recognized by the Disability Act compared to 5 years ago. So what that does is, of course, the government is doing what it's doing, but it gives organizations like us or individuals like us uh, an impetus to, let's say, go to a corporate for funding and say what we are doing is not just benefiting people at the grassroots, because that's the end goal at the end of the day, but it's also helping you as an organization to fulfill a national agenda or to fulfill an agenda towards the sustainable development goals. So that kind of gives them a push to say, okay, we will back you and we will support you, and we see what you're trying to do. Because at the end of the day, unfortunately there is still this kind of vision or this kind of perception of people with disabilities as people who deserve sympathy. But that's not the case. There have been international organizations that have done intensive research which say that there's up to $1 trillion of global economy, which the spending power which is held by people with disabilities globally, which is not being tapped into by businesses because they are not targeting their product or services towards people with disabilities. So we're not just deserving of inclusion because we are human beings and it's a human right, first of all, but also because it makes business sense. For we are people, 15% of the world's largest minority is people with disabilities. And fortunately or unfortunately, a disability is something that can happen to you at any phase in your life. So the more inclusive we are in our offerings, the more inclusive we teach our children to be from the get-go. As you get older and enter into the workforce, that's only going to help you.
Devika, you're so impressive, because I think you've hit the nail on the head by, showing the carrot to businesses in terms of the economics that is involved. And that's so very important in these days. Also, you made a really crucial point that when the government takes this up seriously, it becomes a part of the national consciousness. And like you said, in the last few years, you've seen a lot of changes. What would you say have been, because of the kind of efforts made by the government, would you say would be the top differences that you've seen in how people with disabilities are treated and the kind of opportunities that they have today?
I think coming from a sports background, the first thing I would say is that when we go into rural areas and we do these workshops around basically educating people on disability and educating them on what are the government schemes that are available, or how they should get their documents in order to get their pensions or what have you. One of the first questions that we face now is, okay, this has happened. My child got into an accident. One of his legs got amputated. It's been 8 months. So now what are his future prospects, or how can you help us to get him into sports, or where can I get an artificial limb for him, or where can I procure a wheelchair, and how can we be financially assisted towards these things. These are the questions now, basically, which means that you are still seeing a future. Correct. For a person with disability, whereas 10 years ago if you met the same people, they would have that perception that this individual's life has come to a standstill. Because I actually meet, like now when we have the state level competitions in para athletics, I have actually met children whose injuries are just 8 months old, and they're already out there, and they're already seeking a future in sports or exploring other options. So I think that mindset shift is one of the greatest positive outcomes that has come out of this, because like you said, once it becomes a positive aspect of the nation's consciousness rather than an aspect of pity or sympathy, that mindset shift is the greatest thing. Everything else can follow. You can assign more budgets to things, and infrastructure can fall in place, but unless people's minds are not ready to view you as a productive human being, none of that is going to matter.
Correct. I agree with you completely. That the mindset has to shift, and it can only shift with initiatives like this. But having said that, this also must be, apart from all the opportunities that are coming up and icons like you, your mother, who are giving so much of confidence to people with disabilities to come forward and sort of take, hold of the kind of opportunities that come towards them. Apart from that, it must also be mentally very taxing. Emotionally, it must be difficult for people with disabilities to actually step forward, whether there are opportunities or not. How do you think they can deal with it the way you've dealt with it?
So I think one of the things I believe, again coming from my personal observation of the key difference between how I encountered a disability versus how my mother did it. So I don't really remember a life before this. For me, this has been my reality since the beginning. Whereas my mother was somebody who was a very active sports person. She was very enthusiastic about motorbikes, any crazy thing, any adventure that you can think of, that was part of her spirit. And then someone like that at the age of 30 years old suddenly cannot move around anymore without being dependent on a wheelchair or two people to help her out. So that shift in how you have to live your life from here on out, and the positivity with which she embraced that. She kept the same spirit, like she still wanted to be an adventurer, she still wanted to be a sports person, so she just figured out how to do that in this now new body. And that challenge, that is the first challenge as a person with disability that you face, especially when you acquire a disability later in life, is to how to still be the same person, just that now instead of using your own legs or your own arms, you are using assistive aids. And that is where psychology comes in a big way. And fortunately, I have an educational background in psychology, so rehabilitative counseling is one of the major things that we also provide free of cost to people who get in touch with us through our NGO.
And this is the NGO that you're talking about, the organization which is called Wheeling Happiness Foundation, and you are a co-founder.
Yes, I co-founded it along with my mother, again, like I said, for the key reason that how do we enable people with disabilities from financially underserved backgrounds. That was the key thought behind it. And one of the ways in which we differ from a lot of organizations in this space is that we don't necessarily provide one particular vocational skill training. It is more to do with, as a beneficiary, when you approach me, what is it that you want to do with your life and how can I enable that, whether it is sports, whether it is education, whether it is even fashion. Just before the COVID lockdown and everything shut down, we actually organized a national level pageant for deaf girls and boys, which was a proper national level beauty pageant where people participated from 21 states. And recently we organized a national level physically challenged cricket tournament. So it's more targeted to who you want to become and how you want to be enabled.
And you've been obviously doing all this great work. There must be some case studies that are like successful stories.
Absolutely. So there's been unfortunately a lot of cases where women come from broken homes as a result of acquiring a disability. So when they acquire a disability later in life, their spouses abandon them. And I'm saying this because we've had at least 4 such cases where people were in marriages, but as soon as things got real, like now like you married somebody who was walking and now they're not walking anymore, but you still have your household, you still have your children, and they just abandon them. And so now these women approach us kind of looking to reinstate their identities, looking to restart their lives, and they have gone on to achieve great things in sports. One of them, we kind of assisted her to get a modified vehicle and drive, which in turn enabled her to get a job, because she was not able to get a job essentially because whatever she would earn was going towards paying the driver, because you start from a low paying job. So once we got her a vehicle, taught her how to drive it, modified it for her with hand controls, then she could earn a living. Another girl went on to do very well in sports nationally and internationally. Younger girls I have who I have put through college, because unfortunately the government college that they made it through did not have the accessible infrastructure, so we had to get them through one of the private universities where they had the accessible infrastructure available to them. But then I had to ensure that we incurred the cost of their education through the foundation. So there are so many examples. The first girl who won the Miss Deaf World pageant. So this is a proper Miss World level pageant that happens, and she won Miss India, and then she came to us looking to how to increase that level and how to truly represent the country at an international level. Went through 6 months of intensive pageant training with the best pageant coaches, because we approached them and said, this girl has the will to do this and we want you to come to her level and train her. So when we went to South Africa with her, we had a sign language interpreter, we had a designer, we had a makeup artist, like all the works, and she won the title. And since 19 years this pageant was happening, and for the first time an Indian won the Miss World title. So there's lots of these success stories, and I think what I appreciate the most is that most of these people in turn, like even people who I have just donated a wheelchair to, because it costs 15,000 a decent wheelchair that can last them 3-4 years, and they become a part of the network, and then they refer us to other people in need. So they become our volunteers. Similarly, during COVID, we adopted almost 90 families in as far-flung areas as Jammu and Kashmir, because we had local volunteers who were willing to go and distribute the rations, distribute the first aid in their own communities. So for almost 1 year, we had 90 families under our wing who had at least one disabled family member, and the main earning member of that family had lost their income due to the lockdowns. So I think it just goes to show that when you hold their hand and give them the empowerment that they are looking for, they will in turn become productive members of society. It's not just that you are doing charity, you are actually creating empowered, productive citizens for the nation.
My God, the amount of work that you've done and the kind of difference you've made makes us feel like we've not done anything, because your work doesn't just go or limit itself to yourself. The fact that you, your mother, and the other case studies like you told us about have gone ahead to represent India, that sort of national loyalty is absolutely very commendable. What would you say to young people today? There seems to be a sort of sense amongst a lot of young people of, maybe they take challenges a little bit harsher. What would you say to them?
See, I think I look at the young population as an asset, because majority of this country's population is under the age of 35. Then when you take the lens a little bit larger, if we are looking at Commonwealth nations, because I do a lot of work with Commonwealth nations, so again in all of those 54 or 55 countries, 60% of the population is under the age of 30. So these young people must be doing something right, because they are the largest demographic and the world is where it is today. So definitely I think the young people, they have a lot of gumption, they have a lot of ambition. I think the only message I would have is to channel it in such a way that, of course, it's great that you start businesses, you become entrepreneurs, you have startups, whatever it is that you do, as long as in addition to a personal benefit, you are ensuring that whatever you do is giving back to the community in some way or the other. I think that will beautifully balance things out. And most importantly, whatever we do, I mean, even some of the greatest inventions that have, that we use in our day-to-day lives now without thinking about it, like the remote control or the first typewriter. All these things were actually created to give facilities to people with disabilities, and then they have come into regular use and become privileges and facilities for everyone, not just people with disabilities. So any young person, when they are starting out a venture or basically looking at doing anything with their lives, if they can keep in mind to be as inclusive as possible, whether it comes to disability, whether it comes to gender identity, it's not that difficult to be inclusive. Even basic infrastructure, if you are creating, you can have, in addition to some stairs, you can have a ramp.
Which is what I wanted to ask you next, is that is it mandatory in our country today to have alternatives like this?
So yeah, if you look at the building code, which was updated, I suppose, alongside the Disability Act in 2016, it does lay out very clear rules for infrastructure and how infrastructure needs to be inclusive. I think a lot of public spaces are still catching up to kind of, modifying their environment in a way that it meets those standards. But definitely, as if you look at the laws, if you look at the written word, I believe that India has some of the clearest, laws and regulations, some of the most inclusive laws and regulations. Execution sometimes has gaps, but for that, I feel like there are people like us, and there are many other organizations working on the ground who can help to make that execution a reality.
Do you work with schools also nowadays? Does your organization work with schools to make them more aware, or to create some sort of awareness drives?
Right, so we do a lot of these awareness drives with schools, with corporates. My mother has extensively trained airlines on how to interact with people of various disabilities, how to assist people of various disabilities when it comes to wheelchair maneuvers. So any large scale institution that we talk about, colleges, schools, we go to village level, panchayats, and in addition to the Red Cross and the disability officer of that district, we have these awareness workshops with the people, not just the people with disabilities, but also their peers and their relatives, because it's important for them also to have an open mindset to kind of not restrict the person with disability. Sometimes they do that because of concern, sometimes they do that because of taboos, to think that, oh, like, is it safe for our child to go out into the world? Okay. So opening their minds up to the possibilities for people with disabilities, consulting with corporates. In fact, now corporates come forward and ask us, like, what more can we do to ensure that a person with a disability feels welcome in this work environment, and what reasonable accommodations should we make to ensure that they're able to execute their responsibilities well, which is a wonderful transformation.
Absolutely. I mean, one wouldn't realize that this kind of transformation has already happened, and obviously because of organizations like yours and, the kind of work that you've been doing, these kind of changes are coming into society. But tell me specifically, when we talk about sports, how does sports really sort of add to the kind of confidence that a child with disability needs?
So specifically, when you talk about physical disability, the first thing that you will notice in someone with a physical disability is how it limits them. For example, if somebody is using a wheelchair and they're not walking, or if somebody has lost one of their limbs, then your first reaction would be, oh, so like this person is missing one limb, how must they be going about their daily tasks? So, sports is that avenue, whether you are doing it competitively or recreationally. First of all, it will give you that self-confidence, because the same body which people view as lacking something, you are physically exerting that same body to achieve some results. That is the first thing. And the second thing is that, of course, it gives you the self-confidence, but it also makes people look at you in a different way. Like, you know, they're looking at you as an athlete or as a sports person rather than a disabled person who deserves some pity or sympathy. And most importantly, I think sports gives you that sense of community. When you go and you practice any sport in a sporting environment, you'll always have at least 5 or 6 other people who will be practicing there with you. And nowadays, fortunately, most of the sports practice that I notice, it's become integrated. So people with disabilities and non-disabled athletes are training together. So that would also give a fresh perspective to the non-disabled athlete, you know, to look at the disabled athlete at par with themselves. Because if somebody is winning an Asian medal and training with somebody else who is winning an Asian Para Games medal, they're at the same level, you know, and they deserve the same accolades. They get the same accolades now from the government. They receive the same rewards. So this integration obviously helps a disabled person to feel like a part of the society, but more importantly, it helps the non-disabled people to kind of, you know, switch their lens and view these people with disabilities as one of them.
Correct. Let me ask you a question that I've asked you earlier, but in a slightly different way, is how do you think people with disabilities can become examples for people or young children without disabilities? Because, you know, the challenges that people with disabilities have faced, young people with disabilities have faced, are absolutely unique and challenging because, you know, they're young and yet, you know, they've achieved so much. How could they become examples for the youth without disabilities?
I think in my view, it is not always a great idea to, you know, present a person with disability as an inspiration as such, because we talk about people who get into sports or we talk about people who are in fashion, like whatever we have discussed so far. But it could just as well just be a person with disability living a normal life, doing a 9-to-5 job, and they don't necessarily want to be perceived as an inspiration. They just want to be perceived as everyone else. You know, I should not deserve an elevator instead of a staircase because I am inspirational. I should deserve it only because, like, you know, I also go here. So there should be a way for me to go here. But specifically, if we talk about, you know, what young people can generally learn from observing a person with disability, I would say it would be the same as how you have any other idol. Like, you know, if you have a world famous basketballer, because everybody has their journey of struggle, everybody has their journey of achievement that doesn't come easy. So anybody who's achieved something or, you know, reached a certain level, whether it's a person with a disability or without, their life journey will teach you something. And I think the most important lesson that you learn from the life journey of any achiever is a level of resilience and perseverance. And for a disabled person, that resilience and perseverance, you need it just to exist, you know, just to go about your day to day. So I think those are definitely 2 lessons you can learn from any person with a disability. They don't necessarily have to be heroes, you know, like every person has their own personality. So being disabled doesn't automatically make me a good person, and neither is the reverse true. But just the fact that a person with a disability is navigating all these hurdles and getting out of their house and going about their day requires a certain level of resilience and perseverance, which doesn't come overnight, because like I said, we counsel a lot of people to, you know, reach that frame of mind. But if any young person without a disability is observing a person with disability, the first thing you have to keep in mind is that it takes 10 times the amount of resilience and perseverance for them to just wake up in the morning and go about their day. So that is a big takeaway, and that is the main reason why I said it's very important to be integrated, because the more people with and without disabilities will share spaces,
the more normal it will be. And I have to agree with your point of view, and I think it's quite rational to say that, the level of normalization has to be to an extent where you don't look at them as different, but as equals. Having said that, let me come to one of my final questions. You have been a speaker on many big platforms. I think Shogam was your one of the biggest platforms that you've been on, and you addressed almost over 50 heads of states. What did you say? What was your message to them, and what was the reaction that you got?
So that was definitely one of the pivotal moments of my life, because in 2015 I had received an award for social service at the Buckingham Palace, and then 3 years later in 2018, when they were hosting the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, they invited me back to the opening ceremony, which means that I was on the stage, and on the right side you had all the important political dignitaries of the UK, and on the left side you had the prime ministers of 53 countries, including our own, and they gave me 2.5 minutes. Wow. And I was only one of the 4. Like, the Queen spoke, the Prime Minister of the UK spoke, and then the current Commonwealth Chair and the incoming Commonwealth Chair. Those are the only people who spoke over there, and then there was me. And they said you have 2.5 minutes. And so, because this is a biennial meeting that basically takes place where all of these countries come together to decide on a mutual agenda going forward, my key message to them in those 2.5 minutes was, whatever agendas you decide upon, whether it's the economic agenda, whether it's the climate agenda, whether you're talking about gender, there is an intersection of disability in all of these. And we have to remember that there is more than 1 billion of us disabled people out there. So you have to be intersectional, and you have to be inclusive in any agenda that you set going forward for the future of the Commonwealth and the world at large. And kind of giving out that message, and as a young person, like I was barely 27 at the time, having all of these prime ministers listening to you, and having your own prime minister in that audience, and also the recent prime minister of the New Zealand, who I really admire and look up to, she was in the audience as well. In fact, we ended up having a conversation later on. So it really made me feel like there has been an impact, because it was not just one of those things where you receive an award and you move off stage. I actually had something to say, and I had these people in attendance listening to me and hopefully implementing that when they sat down to set up their agendas for the next 2-3 years.
Devika, that's absolutely fantastic to hear that you had a platform like that, and we had you to represent India on a platform like Shogam. It's been absolutely wonderful to have you here, and you really sort of cleared the nuances of what it means to have a disability and what it requires to go through life. Thank you so much for taking the time out for being here. I know you have a very busy schedule, but we hope to have you on again, possibly next time with your mother.
That would be really wonderful.
Thank you, Devika. That was the most eloquent Devika Malik, a young para-athlete who has faced more challenges in her life than most of us put together. She has not only kept her spirits up, but has also put her society and her nation first. Much to learn from such an inspirational life. Thank you for watching. Until next time.